Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining the PeerTAC sponsored workshop, Collaborative Approaches for Leaders of Youth Peer Advocates, presented by Meghann Simpson and Katie Morse in the inaugural Supervision Summit by PeerTAC. I am Matthew McDonald, and I will be the moderator for this session. Your microphones will be muted and cameras off to eliminate background noise and distractions. We encourage you to use the chat box to introduce yourself and ask questions. We've already touched on that a bit, but please choose everyone in the chat box for your comments to be visible to all attendees. This session will be recorded, and a link to the recording, presentation slides, and any handouts associated with the session will be posted on the PeerTAC website within the next 30 days. If you lose internet connection or accidentally leave the Zoom room, choose the link next to the title of this workshop in your program to rejoin this session. If you are seeking CE credit for this session, you cannot use a phone link and you will need to sign in. 10 minutes are reserved at the end of the session to ask questions. You will receive instructions by email from the Alliance for Rights and Recovery for completing the workshop evaluation. We encourage you to complete this evaluation to let us know how we did. If you are seeking CE credits for your participation, you will need to return the evaluation within 48 hours for processing. With that, PeerTAC would like to thank Meghann Simpson and Katie Morse. To learn more about the presenters with their complete bios, please visit the Supervision Summit website and click their photos. And now, please welcome Meghann and Katie.
I am glad to see you guys here. We will start. Meghann, do you want to start with agendas and everything?
Yeah, why don't we start with the agenda? You want to go to the next slide?
Mm-hmm. Oh, how about we do our poll first, then we'll know. Think so?
Yeah, the poll will probably be good first.
Yes. So we're going to just do a quick poll just to kind of see who's in the room. Just choose whatever fits you best. Even if you're kind of in more than one role or something, you can choose what one you want to share for this. We would just like to make sure the training is as appropriate as possible for those that are in the room. And so we thought this would help us kind of adjust some of the information as we go based on what the dynamics are we have here today. Looks like we have all 10 of 10 that have participated. And our poll. You can share results too, just in case you're curious about what those look like to everybody who's in the room. So it looks like we definitely have some different types of supervisors or other service providers or other peers. Several people identify as a peer. And then it looks like we've got 6 and under years of experience that we're going to be working with. So great. Thank you all for sharing that information, and we'll go ahead and get started.
All right, so for our agenda today, we're going to start off by talking about building rapport and hiring strategies for when employing YPAs. We're going to get into the role dynamics between a supervisor and a YPA and how we want to build that dynamic and what that's supposed to look like. We're also going to talk about accommodations for the peer status, which is different than the supportive strategies. And Katie's going to do an excellent job at explaining those differences. Then we're going to talk about supportive strategies, and this is really going to be how can we as supervisors provide support to our peers as they are managing their own life stressors, as they're working on the job, as they're engaging in different things, or when life stressors go on and they need some extra support because the life stress is affecting their performance. And we're also going to explore different opportunities for growth that YPAs often experience. All right, next slide. Okay, so rapport and hiring. So first we want to go over the characteristics of a youth peer advocate. So there's a lot of different characteristics that we might be looking for when we're seeking to hire a youth peer advocate, and there are some different unique ones that people like. However, I'm going to go over some general common ones. So we definitely want a youth peer advocate to have an awareness of diversity, equity, and inclusion before they start the job. We want them to have some sort of awareness, even if they don't have all of the information, because as leaders, we're going to continue to provide them information. We also want the YPA to know the YPA Code of Ethics. This is something that we should be asking when we're doing our interviews and asking, do you know the YPA Code of Ethics? Can you share how you demonstrated those? We want YPAs who are self-aware of their personal triggers, because their triggers could affect how they perform and engage with different youth. And we also want to be very conscientious of supporting them and being respectful of that YPA's trigger. We also want a YPA that has personal wellness skills. They engage in activities to take care of themselves, whatever that might look like. It could be a gym routine, it could be getting regular massages, it could be a routine that they do for themselves, just some sort of wellness strategies. As always, we want a YPA who is compassionate and empathetic. We also want a YPA that is trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive and has that awareness walking into this role. We also want a YPA that is dedicated and motivated to support youth. That motivation is going to be consistent in supporting the youth in what they are doing. And then they also have to be knowledgeable about youth serving systems. Not every YPA is going to be able to list 5 different systems that youth are involved in, but if they can share a few and explain those, then that's beneficial, and we can always give them more information about the other systems that they might not be aware of. So then another thing that we want to draw attention to is a characteristic of a YPA is their unique healing journey. And their unique healing journey is going to look different than everyone else's because it's unique and it's them. And we want to be aware of that. We want to have consideration on how they are going to share their story. What parts of their story are they comfortable sharing? And if this YPA is even in a place where they feel comfortable sharing their story with a youth. For an example, if they are interacting with a youth that has a similar trauma, they might be comfortable sharing their story, or sharing their story could be triggering, and we have to be aware of that. So being conscientious of the YPA's healing journey. And I'll pass it over to Katie.
Okay. So Meghann just gave us a lot of different qualities or characteristics that we want to see in YPAs, and some of those can be growth happening over time, right? Some of those opportunities to grow those skills. But I wanted you to take a couple of minutes and think, what are the top qualities, like maybe 2 or 3 qualities or skills you want to find in an employee or YPA? And if you want to share some of those in the chat box, that would be great. But what are those top couple of qualities you are looking for in an employee or YPA? You know, for example, when I think about the couple that I'm looking for a YPA or any employee, is I'm looking for integrity. A lot of staff are working, the agency I work with, they're working out in the field without me there, without anybody else there. So that integrity piece is very important. When I think of other pieces, I want to see that they're connected to their story. Do they seem like they're in a space that they can strategically share it, while at the same time not so distant that it doesn't feel real? And I want to find somebody who has a passion for youth and for a passion for some of the grassroots belief within youth services. So we got Malin said same integrity, empathy. Empathy is a good one when we think about that, you know, person in the hole and you jump in with them and sit there with them. Absolutely. Empathy. Anything else that people think of? So I'd really encourage you, if you don't have those couple of qualities or skills you're looking for within staff, really think about those pieces, because you need to have questions that give you those answers. We've got a few more coming in. Someone who's positive about learning, integrity, dependable, self-aware. Absolutely, when we're talking about that strategic sharing, what they're bringing to the table. Understanding the importance of boundaries, definitely in peer support. Resilience. We help support youth to gain those resilient skills. Someone who can understand the history of the movement in which we're working. Yes, Eileen, I like that. Yes, that grassroots piece I'm very passionate about. So a couple of the things you should probably think about when you're interviewing are, what are potential deal breakers? Like, this doesn't work, you know, in this environment. Some of the time when I see integrity things, those are pieces within an interview that I'm like, oh, we can't do this. But what do those look like? And then really challenge yourself to go back and how do you create questions to make sure you're getting that information right at the beginning. So the beginning really, really matters when we're starting that relationship of a potential, you know, new hire. It really matters. The way that I typically start my interviews is I'm going through, I'm introducing myself, I'm including my pronouns in there, and I'm asking that potential employee, you know, what they would like to be called during the interview and if they would like to share their pronouns. That information, I think, is very respectful to know what they want to be called during that process, because maybe the legal name that came through is not the name that they like to be called. And also doesn't always tell you what pronouns they would like to use. On the flip side, the population of youth that we are currently serving are members of the LGBTQ+ community, and just asking that simple question at the beginning for them to share, I usually gather a lot of opinion about their cultural awareness right at the get-go, right at that very beginning. Some other pieces you might want to consider in that interview process is asking their knowledge on youth leadership, facilitation, principles, code of ethics, documentation, advisory boards. And then there's just a couple of questions there that we've utilized as ways to gather more additional information. So when we talk about that beginning matters, we're really talking about that onboarding process. So some of that is staying connected through that hiring process so someone doesn't get lost. Several agencies, you need to go through extensive clearances, and some YPAs this might be their first job, and it's probably even more likely it's first time of having to fill out the level of clearances that some places are requiring. So helping support them through that onboarding process is really important. The other piece is making sure that when you have a new person coming on, that you're helping connect them with not just you, but other members of the team. That really helps with that longevity, because they feel more engaged right at the beginning. Versus, what if the main person they're connected with leaves the agency and then they feel that isolation and being alone? So really that importance of building those connections right at the beginning. One of the things I do within the interviews also is I typically strategically share a little bit about my story that I identify as a peer. I dealt with my own depression, anxiety right at the beginning, because I give an example of what does strategic sharing slightly look like. And then during our first internal YPA meeting, or our second one, we typically share our stories. Part of that is just about that practice, having them get used to sharing their story in a safe space before they are out with youth and trying to figure out how do they strategically share some of that. Some of the other things that I think are important to start weaving in right into the interview is the transparency, those expectations. So the importance of having youth involved in their plan. What questions can you ask in regards to youth voice and youth leadership? You know, making sure that we're looking at policies and procedures right at the beginning so that they know what is expected of them. And then throughout your time, as you are going on this journey of learning how to supervise YPAs and, you know, expanding that field, it's important to look at preventive measures, what has worked in the past, what has not worked, and go ahead and put that into practice. And I'm going to pass it back over to Meghann.
All right, so next we go into building strong connections and team bonding. Now, when Katie talked about forming connections and having YPAs meet other individuals in the agency, I draw attention to that, as it does make a big difference. And I want to give an example. When I was a YPA working in a clinical organization that provided treatment to youth, I did not know anyone in the agency. I didn't. I knew only the counselors that the youth that I was working with received therapy from. And it felt very isolating. And then my supervisor did leave after a year. And then I had no connections. and I took her role, I took her position as a supervisor with no knowledge of any of the other departments. So forming those connections really does make a difference, even if that YPA is not going to be building up into a leadership role in the agency, it still is going to make connections to the other individuals and help support them when and if you decide to leave. So further building connections, YPAs are an individual. They're not just a staff member. And I like to move away from calling us just staff members. I like to call us team members because we're creating a different culture when we say team. So we want to acknowledge that they're an individual. They have their own personal experiences. They have their own stressors, and that's going to impact their job. Just like you yourself might have your own family challenges going on that might impact your ability to perform your job. So we want to be conscientious of that. Katie also shared a little bit about how sharing your personal experience, even just a small amount, can form that familiarity and that comfort and that connection. It's really good. And then lastly, we want to be compassionate and mindful of the stressors that the YPA might be experiencing that can impact their job performance. One of the things I'll repeatedly go back to is triggers. We really need to respect a YPA's triggers because if we don't, that YPA will suffer mentally or they will leave the agency, one or the other. And then the personal stresses, just as we would want compassion for our life challenges, we still want to give compassion to them. If they're not having a 100% day, they might be giving their 100%, but it's, maybe 60 in comparison to how they were yesterday. We still want to be compassionate towards that. So when it comes to team bonding, Katie is going to share a little bit about that.
Right. So I am a big supporter when we're looking at team bonding. Whenever I have a new youth peer advocate come on, or even another team member that works within our youth program, we really try to help build those connections, help play off of people's strengths, do activities. One of the things that we are doing right now is we have a new youth peer advocate. So we've really increased our YPA internal meetings in order to help build those connections. Some of the things that we do during those have dual purposes. For example, we do icebreakers. Part of that is to help with that team bonding. The other part is to give ideas. How can you facilitate groups? What does it look like when you facilitate an icebreaker? Also give opportunities like, hey, does somebody want to take on this icebreaker next time? So maybe if someone hasn't had an opportunity to facilitate in a group setting, that youth peer advocate is gaining that skill while we're also helping with that team bonding. So most things that we do in meetings really have more than just one piece of it. We also have a lot of fun. There's also a piece of wellness in there. Some of the time we ask really bizarre questions, and we really get to know those people, right? I did say it kind of backfired on me the other day, though. I said, like, what are 3 words if you had to describe yourself? And one of the words was caretaker that I went with. And let me tell you, the next 2 weeks after that, the level of caretaking that I did, like, tripled basically. So be careful if you use that one. But anyways, really utilizing those pieces though to gather people's information, what do they see about themselves, is going to help pull out those strengths. Some other things to consider while you're doing team bonding is utilizing the strengths of the team. So if you see that you have a staff member who might be really, really good at getting their documentation done in a timely manner, or maybe they're really good with being flexible with the youth that they're working with and changes that might come along, have them see if they can do a little presentation in those YPA meetings. Help them start building those skills so that they can do presentations in the community, but also so their YPAs can hear it from a source other than you as a supervisor. What can they learn from each other? Another couple of things I do for team bonding is a lot of the time we'll have special projects we're working on, such as, developing information that is person-centered for intakes, those kind of things. Typically, how we do that is we have a meeting and we all discuss it. Everybody gives feedback. And then usually I get myself out of the mix. So I take myself out. It's kind of like passing that torch onto them, get myself out of the mix. They stay on the meeting and they develop that material. And then the next time we meet, I come back on and they share with me the material and we discuss it so that they really can take ownership of that and leadership of it. I think it also helps them grasp onto, like, this is important to us and we want to utilize this material because we've helped create it. So it teaches that piece of it also. one activity that I use a lot for utilizing strengths, and I actually came up with because I had some team dynamics that every single time something was over, I got a phone call from multiple staff saying this person did this or this person did this. So I pulled them together, and this was before we had youth peer advocates. We were still very grassroots, but I pulled them together and I assigned them to come up with a strength of someone else in the room. And some of the time it's just random. Some of the time it is like, we're going to come up with a strength for somebody that we know there's conflict for there. But just doing that sometimes shifts people's perspective, because you have to come up with a strength for someone instead of coming up with, well, that person really irritates me as a coworker, right? We've got to come up with our strength. So I find that's a very helpful thing. Plus it ends in a very positive place. People like to see like, hey, someone noticed that I did this really well. You know, my compassion or my empathy spoke out. So that strengths is definitely a powerful way to end a meeting and do some team bonding and recognition of those strengths. And I'm going to pass it back over to Megan.
All right, so role dynamics and mutual collaboration. So part of this entire presentation, all of the topics we're covering is about mutual collaboration. It is about developing this proper role dynamic in a positive environment. But now we're going to really key into the dynamic between the YPA and the supervisor and how that looks. So first, we want a supervisor that is going to recognize and acknowledge and embrace the team of YPAs and their skills and their input. So we want a supervisor who is going to consult the YPA team for all decisions regarding youth treatment or department changes. We want them to be fully involved. When there's challenges that YPAs are experiencing, whether individually or the department is experiencing challenges, we want to come together as a team and develop a solution. Because as Katie said, one YPA might struggle with documentation and the other one might be really good at it. So how can we meet in the middle and have one YPA teach the other YPA or coach the entire group of YPAs? And that's utilizing our strengths. And it's also, as a supervisor, embracing the skill sets that are at our team and creating that culture of inclusion. So then each YPA has a voice and a leadership role during team meetings. You know, we want to recognize that not everyone is very extroverted and is going to speak first. You know, that's really my trait. I love to do that. Other people might be more reserved. They might be more hesitant to use their voice. They might not be comfortable sharing, or they might be worried that what they're going to say is not going to be positively received. So when we recognize that, we're recognizing that we have to embrace and potentially call upon or give the opportunity for each person to share if we're not calling on them. For an example, we might go around the table and each person shares something. And now instead of putting anyone on the spot, everyone has the opportunity to share. And then you can also have, if you don't have a solution, maybe just say pass. And that's creating that environment where everyone's voice is recognized. And then supervisors should be receptive to all feedback that is positive as well as constructive criticism. Now, when we hear the term criticism, we get really kind of defensive. We don't really want to hear the criticism. We usually associate to a negative perception. But when I say constructive criticism, this means that you are receiving feedback for improvement. Constructive criticism is a fantastic thing. And if you're a supervisor who is not receptive to constructive criticism from your YPAs, you are not going to build your skills in being an effective supervisor. And when a YPA gives you constructive criticism, they're trying to help out you. They're trying to help out the team. They understand that their feedback is going to make an impact on the entire team. So us as supervisors, we want to be receptive to that, even if we might not agree with the feedback we're receiving, or even if we have our own feelings and knowledge about a challenge that is receiving constructive criticism for, and that YPA might not know. So we also want to recognize that YPAs might have different information and perception of challenges than we do. And I'm going to pass it back over to Katie.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to explore the difference between a boss and a leader. I know there's some people on here who don't supervise at the moment, or, you know, you might be in a mentor role. And I think when we talk about leadership, a leader is someone who inspires others. There's someone who connects. So even if you're not in a position of a technical supervisor, you can still be a leader. You can still help lead just by the way that you are an example for it. So I wanted to take a couple minutes in the chat box. Question is, when you think of someone who's a leader, so think of someone in your life that you would say, yep, that person is a leader. And then think about what are the qualities that you notice about them. Throw some of those qualities into the chat box so we can look at them and talk about them for a minute. Qualities you see when you think of someone in your life who's a leader. They could be a supervisor. They could just be somebody who is a mover and a shaker and gets stuff done, right? Could be either one. Good communicator, absolutely. They can communicate with various people with different styles. Open-minded, honest, authentic, inspirational. Yes, yeah, you can trust who they are because they are being their authentic self. Open-minded, can hear other people's perspectives, provides constructive feedback, teaches rather than directs, absolutely. Empathetic, honesty, courage. Oh, I like courage, definitely. You know, I have a quote later on, but when we think about kindness and everything, it definitely takes courage sometimes, because sometimes we have to be vulnerable in order to be kind in on unkind situations. So I like the word courage also. Practice is what they preach. Absolutely. We can't say one thing and do another one. Vulnerability. Absolutely. So what I challenge you to do is you have all sorts of great things in there for leadership. And I want to challenge you to take one of those that somebody has put in there, or one that you think maybe you could be grow in, be an opportunity for growth. Jot it down and think, how can I add this into my personal leadership style? How can I kind of hone in and focus on this and really grow that skill, right? And also, you know, once you have grown that skill, how did I learn it and how can I help teach it to somebody else? I'm a big, strong believer when it comes to the history of the youth movement that we really have to pass that torch. We have to keep growing people and developing them. So how can you pass that on? A couple of things between bosses versus leaders. And I'm not saying there is not ever a time where we don't have to be like a boss or a supervisor. Some of the things when we look at a boss is, you know, they create rules, you know, sometimes they have to enforce rules. And there are times as supervisors where we do sometimes have to enforce those safety rules, right? There has to be like, this has to take place. And there are times where we have to do that responsibility. However, overall, a leader is going to be someone that people want to follow. They're going to inspire others. They connect. They don't just speak at you. They connect with you and really understand what you're saying. They create a vision that people want to buy into, right? You've got a vision that people can see. Yes, I want to join that and I want to move that way too. They offer coaching, they offer guidance, but they help motivate that team. And also, leader doesn't always mean that they're the ones leading. They could be, you know, kind of in the background, just slowly encouraging and helping that team grow those strengths and make sure that they know, you know, guess what? You have these strengths. You can do this too, and help motivate them to take those steps forward. We'll look at some team approaches. We talked a little bit about some ways that we could do team bonding. So once we kind of have that team bonding there, I'm a firm believer of really coming up with some team approaches for managing conflicts that come up or managing different pieces. We live in, a lot of us are living in a billable versus non-billable world, right? And that can create things when it comes to direct service is really maybe focused more on the youth themselves, while some of the time, you know, management has to look at like the numbers and how can we make sure this is affordable and sustainable. So typically when we're looking at some of those pieces, or we just went through an audit and we got told, hey, you need to put these things into place, right? I bring it back to the youth peer advocates and I say, listen, this service is important to you. We want to make sure it's the best possible opportunity for youth to participate in. These are some of the things we've got to do. What are your ideas to accomplish these pieces? I share my ideas, I learn from their ideas, and we come up with a solution for it, right? When it comes to the billable, non-billable world, I have a really hard time with it, but the reality is at the end of the day, I want the service to continue so more youth can be served. So some of the time you've got to focus on, we want this service to be good. We want the service to continue. So some of the time those numbers and those pieces do matter, but encouraging youth peer advocates to be a part of those decisions, be a part of the development, really makes a huge difference on how those things roll out afterwards. Some other things that I think it's important when we're looking at team approaches is Meghann mentioned, being open to that feedback. And as supervisors, we have spaces to grow also, right? There are things that we know, we were triggered ourselves when we got into that situation, right? Maybe we didn't handle it. Maybe things have not worked out today, maybe the car didn't start. I locked my keys in the car the other day. That was lovely. And you just have all these things that have happened in your own life. And truthfully, some of the time, some really hard stuff happening in our own lives, right? We have our own trauma that we might have brought to the table. And so, yes, we have to extend ourselves grace, but at the same time, really reflect on our responsibilities as a supervisor and what are we bringing to the table. And when we have that feedback, making sure that we're taking it into consideration on what could we do maybe differently to help that youth peer advocate. And it might even be a difference of communicating what is needed. So it might not necessarily mean that the thing that you've asked them to do is negotiable. It might be a requirement, but how can we maybe take that feedback and teach it a different way or share it a different way, right? Does it need to be written down? Do we need to do a little bit more of discussion of why this is important and take those steps and take the time to really reflect on what did we do well? What did we maybe not do so well? And I'm going to pass it back over.
All right. So real quick in the chat, guys, I'd love to hear what your definition of code switching is. Can be in the context of our supervision summit, or it can be in any other context. I just want to get an idea of what we think of code switching. All right, so we have changing your mannerisms and dialect to match the social situation you're in. Yep, absolutely. I like that one. Code switching to me is the difference between speaking professionally and speaking to friends. Absolutely, that is a different code switch. Language. Yep, code switching is all about the language and how we're presenting the language. Good, I like these responses. So absolutely, code switching is when we change the language that we're using depending on the situation that we're in. But it can also be when we don't change our language and we're in a situation where the language should be different and we didn't code switch. And this is what I'm calling the code switch trap. And this is when we're in a clinical position. So we're a clinical supervisor and we don't code switch when talking with our YPA or providing supervision. And now we're using clinical terms with that YPA, and we're providing almost a clinical supervision too. And that's not the supervision we want to give them. And we're also not wanting to use clinical language. So when we think clinical language, we think client. We're referring to all of these individuals as clients instead of a youth or by their actual individual name, and we want to recognize that. So with the code switch trap, it's clinical versus peer. This can also be for identifying problems versus solutions in a youth who is receiving services. Identifying problems and trying to treat the problems is more of a clinical approach. Identifying strengths or trying to find solutions for the challenge is more of a peer approach. There's also the approach of SMART goals, S-M-A-R-T, for those who can't understand my accent. So SMART goals are a very clinical, structured format for developing a goal and developing actions. I'll say that as a peer, when I went to a youth and I was helping them goal set and I, started talking about SMART goals, they told me, ma'am, no therapy stuff. Okay. And that is because I myself as a peer did not code switch to the youth. Now, as supervisors coming from a clinical background, we have to take that same idea under consideration. So when we don't code switch as supervisors, this really impacts your dynamic with the YPA, and it impacts the YPA too. So it's going to make the YPA a bit more uncomfortable. They might start to pull away, or they might start viewing that they're a supervisor in a higher authority position, which even though they are the supervisor, it's not keeping that collaborative balance that we're trying to emphasize. And it is also teaching the YPA incorrect skills, because a YPA is not supposed to be speaking or doing clinical work. And then for the youth, it impacts the youth too when we as supervisors don't code switch with our YPA. It's impacting the youth because now they are receiving clinical support approaches from the peer. And that is going to push the youth away, as my situation when they said no therapy stuff. And it's also going to lower the balance of power between the YPA and the youth, because now the youth is going to start perceiving that YPA in more of a clinical role. So then we go on to supervision. Okay, so supervision, we want to provide our YPAs with consistent supervision. So according to the CFTSS program, supervision best practices is 1 hour for every 40 hours worked. So we want to take that under consideration. If you are a part-time worker and you're working less than 40 hours, then maybe bi-weekly supervision is more appropriate. But if you're working 40 or more, maybe weekly is more appropriate. And that's something that you want to consult with your administrative on, and check the regulations for how your program is designed. We also want supervision to be individualized. Someone in the chat earlier put that supervising YPAs is different depending on the YPA. Some YPAs might need a different style, some might need more hands-on, others might be more independent, and we want to recognize that and adjust to that. And then during supervision, we also want to recognize all of the different things that we can do to support the YPA in their job as well as their career development. So we can open up a conversation for what challenges are you having? What successes are you having? Identifying the opportunities for growth for that YPA, when we're going to talk about examples of that later. There's also embracing career development, encouraging the YPA to take maybe a certification course, sharing that there's training resources like Families Together provides monthly trainings, something like that, as well as asking them for their feedback during that supervision. And there's nothing wrong with asking your YPA, how do you like to be supervised? What do you need from me? What do you not like about supervisory styles? And that's going to give you a good idea about how you can best support this YPA. And I'll pass it over to Katie.
Thank you. So a couple other things when we're talking about supervision and some other leadership opportunities. One of the things that I think we talked a little bit about communication throughout, and one of those pieces I think is communicating strategically. I had a role years ago that was for a respite scheduler. And I think it taught me so much about communication, because I could say the same thing, but I could say it 5 different ways to different people, because everybody has a different communication style. So as supervisors, we really need to look at that, is how is our communication style differently than maybe those people that we're serving or supervising, and how can we change some of that to make sure that we're understanding each other. Let's see here. We already covered those pieces. One of the, I actually recently was watching Reels on Facebook, probably when I was supposed to be cleaning or something like that, but I was wasting time on Reels. However, I found a really cool quote when it talks about, we've talked a lot about that transparency, that genuineness and communication, being open, making sure those expectations are clear and set up. And on that, they gave a quote that they used, and I loved it. So I wanted to share it today. When we're talking about that feedback, it says, I'm giving you comments because I have very high expectations, and I'm confident you can reach them. It changes. It changes saying, I might have these really high expectations, but I know you can reach them with support. So then we have somebody reaching higher instead of feeling like they've been, kind of stepped on or that they're not meeting what they need to meet. So I really like that quote. I think that is one of the hardest things with supervising peers at time is some of that relearning, because some of the time it's taken very, very personal and it's hard on them, and it triggers some of those feelings within themselves. So I really like that quote as a way to kind of redirect what we're giving somebody. Some of the other aspects of supervision, it is a balancing act between being supportive, holding accountability, all of those pieces. Some of us are peers, so we have that lived experience. I know there was a question in the chat box also around, I guess in one of the opening speakers that talked about peers should not be getting clinical supervision, and what do we do in those spaces? So off the top of my head, there are youth peer advocates that are being supervised by clinicians, right? That's a piece of it. I would say one of the pieces to put in when we're talking about supervision, if there is a clinical supervisor, how are we growing that peer support? Maybe there's a youth peer advocate that's really showing leadership skills. And maybe on your team meetings, they facilitate the last 15 minutes in like a peer support type aspect. So they're getting some of that peer support, and it grows that youth peer advocate's leadership skills, but it also provides some of that. Utilizing different places like Families Together has youth peer meetings to help with some of that peer, not direct supervision, but some of that support on those technical pieces from that peer perspective. It's definitely a challenge. There's also sometimes those unspoken words that, clinical staff cannot share their lived experience based on policies and procedures, but I would challenge that I'm sure there are some professionals that are clinical that also have that lived experience that have brought them to this place, even if they're not identified as a peer. And I actually had an individual that was one of my son's providers, and she was in a professional role, so she could not share her own lived experience with me. However, when I just talked with her, I figured she was a peer because she was empathetic. She got it. I didn't have to explain it 10 times over like I had to with other providers. And she got it. Later on, it turned out she's also a parent. She's a peer. No wonder she got it. But I think some of the time, even clinical supervisors, you have those times in your life where you went through struggles. You went through those pieces, and kind of pulling that empathy out can help support, even if you aren't not necessarily identified as a peer in that role. So I hope that answered the question. If not, re-put it in the chat box and I'll try to do better next time. But hopefully that answered some different ideas for that piece of it. One last thing that I really wanted to look at in aspects of supervision is that, being that cultural responsiveness and awareness and support for cultural differences among the team members. You might have YPAs that have different values, different beliefs. Maybe they're members of different communities. And how can we make sure that continues to make that team flourish and learn from each other? Also making sure that they understand the cultural dynamics of the youth that they're supporting. So making sure there's opportunities. If they have youth that they're not familiar with certain communities, give them educational opportunities and let them, get some cultural humility training in there. So maybe it doesn't cover everything, but it gives a basic understanding of how do you support someone who might have different values or different cultural beliefs than you do. And next we are going to go over to accommodations. So this I would highly recommend if you have learning this. It's important to have HR involved when you're looking at accommodations. But just as a quick kind of, what are some differences between these? When we look at the definition of supports, it's to bear all or part of the weight of, to hold up, to give assistance to. So an example of a support might be, someone had, one of the youth peer advocates went and they had a really hard service. You know, there was a crisis that happened. They're really struggling. And you might support them through that. You might talk with them and be like, hey, you know what? Do you need to take like a half an hour out here to kind of just, you know, get yourself back in a better space, in a space of wellness? You know, take care of yourself. Maybe it's some processing of what worked well in that space, you know, those types of pieces. That's sometimes a support that we would give to any employee. An accommodation, that is different, because an accommodation, clicked the wrong part on my screen that left me. An accommodation relates to aspects of employment. There are legal stipulations around this, and I can tell you, you know, I haven't went through it from the employer standpoint, but I do have a good friend who did hire a lawyer to contact, you know, and to go through the process. So there are consequences for employers that do not follow ADA regulations. So it is important to realize that there is a difference between supports and accommodations. So accommodations relate to 3 aspects of employment. I took this off the Department of Labor website, so you can go there, use it as a resource, be familiar with it. But accommodations ensure equal opportunity in the application process. It's enabling a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of a job, and making it possible for an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. Some of the ways to think about that too is, you know, like a learning style. It could go either way. It could be a support that is not necessarily an accommodation. It could just be a support. Everyone learns differently. Now, if maybe there needed to be additional trainings, or maybe you had to really redo material in order to accommodate that. Like maybe it was something that was a recorded online thing that you had to read and that was not working. Then it could be more of an accommodation, because this had to be redone for a disability or a need to redo. So some of things, it might fall in either category, and it kind of depends what some of those needs are behind that, whether or not that would be in a support or an accommodation. So I am definitely far from an expert in accommodations, but there are definitely differences that I want you to be aware of as a supervisor, especially some of you are in the very beginning stages of being a supervisor. So being aware that those things do matter. And when you have someone who is asking for an accommodation, typically there is a doctor's note that could be brought in for it. But there are definitely certain rights and laws pertaining to accommodations. That's definitely something you want to get your HR department involved in, so that they can help and make sure everything is done correctly and that person is supported and given what they need in order to be able to do their job. Okay, we are going to move on, and I am going to pass it back over to Meghann.
All right, so supportive strategies. There's a lot of different topics related to supportive strategies, or ways that we can support our YPAs. So the first one I want to address is the one I hear most common, which is a YPA experiencing triggers. So as anyone who has experienced trauma, you're going to have triggers. And that's not unique to peers, that's unique to anyone who has PTSD or has experienced one of the childhood adverse experiences. And so we want to consider how this YPA's triggers could impact their work. And we need to understand that, and we need to be able to support that. So what are some examples of triggers that a YPA might experience? Well, they might read a use case file, and then it might have details about a specific type of trauma. Those details could be triggering as opposed to just having the topic. Now, as a peer, when I am doing my other work for Now She Speaks, which is a domestic violence and interpersonal violence nonprofit, in the support groups that I lead, we emphasize headlines, not the details. And that's something that I take with me into my peer work, is when we're sharing, I'm not going to share the details of my trauma, I'm sharing the headlines. So taking that same phrase under consideration, when a YPA is reading the details of someone's trauma, that itself can be triggering. Another example is when the youth discloses that they have been abused in a certain way. Let's say, for example, you have a YPA who has a history of surviving sexual abuse. Now they're supporting youth, and this youth for the first time discloses their father sexually abused them. Now this YPA is feeling triggered because now they're supporting a youth through the same thing, except this is the first time this has been disclosed. So the youth is very emotionally intense about it as well. They're very vulnerable. So that can be triggering, but even if that wasn't the first time they disclosed abuse, even if it might be the third time they've disclosed abuse, those details might be too much for a YPA to hear. However, not all YPAs are going to be triggered by that situation or by seeing the details of someone's trauma. So we have to, again, take that under consideration. Another example is if a youth has a vivid flashback. Instead of a, let's say, an internal flashback where they experience it mentally, they don't express it externally, and then they just vocalize, yeah, I'm having these visualizations or these flashbacks. That is going to be internal, but when a youth experiences a flashback and expresses it externally, they might be engaging in some different body movements. They might be verbally expressing what is happening in their flashback. That situation can be extremely triggering. And I say that as myself working in a residential setting, there was a youth that I had specifically requested not to work with because she had external flashbacks of the same trauma I had experienced. I was left alone with her one day. She experienced an external flashback. It was a very, very difficult situation for me to deal with, especially because I did not have backup support. So I could not hand the youth off to someone else, which is something I needed to do for my own mental health. So again, that goes back to identifying and recognizing a YPA's triggers and then respecting it. And I ultimately left that job because my trigger was not respected and I had to support a youth through an external flashback that was triggering. And when I brought it up to my supervisors, they were not receptive to my concerns. So we have to recognize these and respect it. And lastly, another triggering example could be if a youth expresses or engages in self-injurious or suicidal behaviors. Some individuals who have attempted suicide in certain ways might be triggered by seeing someone else engaging in the exact same behavior. For example, if a youth is engaging in self-harm, if they are cutting their arm, and that YPA has previous experience engaging in self-harm through cutting, that might be triggering. So those are some examples. Next, how can we support a YPA through their triggers? The first thing we want to do is right during our first supervision after they've been hired, we want to ask them, hey, while working on this job, there might be some situations that could trigger you. If you are comfortable disclosing, however, you don't have to share what you're not comfortable with, I'd like to know what might be some triggers that you could face on the job that would affect your job, your work performance. That's a very open, very respectful question. You're specifically identifying this information is so I can support you while you're performing this job. And that's how we want to phrase it. And we also want to continue to emphasize, you don't have to share the details. I just want to know the trigger so I know how to support you. And we want to emphasize that again, because sharing details might not be comfortable for everyone. So then the types of triggers. There are external triggers. These triggers are involving the 5 senses. So I see someone who reminds me of my abuser. I smell something that reminds me of the time something happened, you know. I touch something that's a similar texture. You know, I was working with someone who, when they were being abused, their head had been rubbed. Now, when this individual walked under a tree and the branches brushed against her head, she had a flashback and that resulted in a crisis. That was an external trigger. So internal triggers, these are the strong emotions that are in a present moment, but the emotion is rooted in a past experience. So let's say that a youth is very, very hurt. Their feelings are hurt. They feel betrayed, even though they have not actually been betrayed. They feel betrayed. They might be having an intense expression of feeling betrayed because it's triggering a previous experience of when they were betrayed by a parent or a family member. Trauma triggers a psychological and nervous system response. This is when our heart starts beating, we start sweating, our thoughts are racing. It's a trauma trigger. It's a PTSD response. And then we have symptom triggers, which is a physical or environmental change which influences greater mental health challenges. An example of that is I have depression. And when it gets closer to winter and the sun is not out as much, I also experience greater depression. What is it? Seasonal depression, and that impacts the depression I already have, and it amplifies it. So taking these different types of triggers under consideration, we want to apply this to not only the youth that we're working with, but also the YPA that we're working with. They might have external triggers, or they might only have internal and trauma triggers. It's going to be unique to them. So getting into some different supportive strategies, I said, discuss triggers in the first supervision, open the conversation, develop a coping plan. On the next slide, we're going to have a coping plan, and I'll give you guys a time to go through those steps. Then we also want to embrace the YPA's personal healing and recovery journey. Embrace this. Ask them, what are your wellness strategies? What do you do to take care of yourself? If they're in counseling, make sure that you are being flexible on their work hours based on when their counselor is available to meet with them. You're providing support for their wellness and healing. If they have to take a medication at a certain time of day and they don't want to take that while engaging with a youth, then you need to provide support by allowing them, okay, during this time of day, you always get a 5-10 minute break. There's nothing involved. And that's going to provide that extra support to them. Other things that we can do is supporting the YPA to engage in the peer community on a local or statewide level. Again, this goes back to some of the things that Families Together does, which is our monthly peer meetings. And then one of the major things that we want to do if a YPA expresses this is to support a YPA, but not insisting that they work with a specific youth. And this goes back to my previous example. I had read this youth's case file. I knew the exact traumas and I knew the details of the trauma. Reading the case file did not trigger me because I'm at a point in my journey where those details don't trigger me. However, I understood that if this youth had an external flashback, I would be triggered by her expressing it. I told my supervisor that. What I needed my supervisor to do was say, okay, we understand that. We will not leave you alone with this youth. And in a group therapy session, or I'm sorry, in a peer group session, we will have a second YPA there in case that youth experiences any challenges. That other YPA will support them. That's what I needed, and I did not receive that. And again, I ultimately left that agency because they did not support me with not being able to help that youth because of my own triggers. So we're going to go on to the next slide and then we'll come back. And I want to show you guys the coping plan. All right, so supervisors, please take a picture of this. If you want it right away, you will receive the slides much later, few weeks, few days, sometime this month, you'll receive the slides. However, take a picture of this. This is a step-by-step guide for coping for YPAs when they have been triggered. So first step, they need to learn how to maintain composure and neutral body language. If this YPA doesn't have the skill to maintain professional composure in their body language, this is your opportunity to coach that. Teach them those skills, encourage that development, give them direction or opportunity. Now we want these YPAs to learn how to separate their personal experience from the youth. When I was witnessing the youth's external flashback, I was watching her body move, I was hearing what she was saying, and she in fact thought that I was the abuser and was saying things to me. Again, one of the reasons why it was a very triggering situation for me. I had to consistently tell myself as I was having my own flashbacks from being triggered, I am not in that situation. This youth situation is not my own. I am not actively being abused. This youth is not actively being abused. Our situations are separate. We have a similarity, but the details, the circumstances are different. And that was me talking to myself, going through this separation and really trying to reinforce that mental boundary. Then we have grounding exercises. Grounding exercises will be different from everyone. We want to encourage that youth to talk to professional supports. This is what the YPA should be saying. They want to encourage the youth to, hey, you want me to contact your counselor? Is there someone else you feel comfortable talking to? We want to try and redirect the youth's attention to another individual who can provide them with the support that us as the YPA cannot effectively do in that moment when we're triggered. Once we've been able to transfer the youth to someone else to provide that support, we need to remove ourselves from the situation and inform our coworker or our supervisor that we need support because of a mental health concern. You don't even have to say that you've been triggered. You just need some support. You can keep that private. And then when the YPA has removed themselves from the situation, here's the step-by-step guide for how they can cope individually on their own. First, private location, or they might want someone to talk to. You might want to talk to the supervisor directly right away. So either or. Next step, talk to the supervisor. Let the supervisor know, and the YPA does not have to share the details. It can simply be, I was triggered. This is what the youth did that triggered me, or this is what I learned that triggered me, and this is how I need support. Always encourage the YPA to take a break, whether it be 10 minutes to a half hour. Try to be supportive on how long they might need. Encourage them to contact a trusted support if they have a friend, if they have their own counselor, if they have their own peer. Encourage them, say, hey, if you got to call anyone, take that time. Here's an empty room in the building where you can just have some privacy. And then there will be some situations where a YPA is extremely triggered and they are not able to come down from that trigger in order to effectively support the youth. And I say that very specifically because a YPA can come down from the trigger and they might still be functioning, but they're not able to be effective. They're not able to demonstrate all of the YPA skills because even though they might appear calm, they're still mentally trying to calm themselves down, which means that if they're still dealing with their own stuff, they can't effectively provide support to someone else, even though they might be able to demonstrate some supportive attempts, and that can still be positively received. But ultimately, the YPA is not able to take care of themselves. So we might encourage this YPA to leave early if we notice that their work performance is significantly impacted, or if we notice that this YPA is experiencing a very intense reaction to this trigger, such as excessively crying or a really overwhelming panic attack, or they start to have their own thoughts that might be concerning to you. We want to encourage them to leave early. Ask them, do you feel like you can get through today? Do you feel like after a half hour, you feel like you can come back and feel confident working? Or do you feel that you're not able to effectively perform your job? And now this can be a little bit tricky. We don't want to just offer this every single time a YPA is triggered. We want to be conscientious about when we offer allowing them to go home early. And if a YPA expresses that to you, you also want to consider the situation on, is this an appropriate time for this YPA to leave early, or should I try to coach them in some of these stress management skills and help them get through the situation and then revisit after a half hour? So take that under consideration. We can jump back.
And Megan, just so you aware of the time, we are at 11:50.
Okay, then I'll kind of go through this real quickly. So then YPAs can experience compassion fatigue and burnout. We want to take that under consideration, just as we can experience that, provide supportive strategies and wellness strategies. And then I'll pass it over to Katie for trauma-informed support.
Yes, and I think due to time, I think you covered a lot with trauma-informed. So I was thinking maybe we should open up for any questions, and then if we have time, we can hit on our last few key points. So, does that sound good, Megan?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I apologize for talking so much.
You're fine. You covered a lot of information there, so that's good. Does anyone have any questions that we can try to support? And then if there aren't any questions, a couple more points, we'll wrap up with you.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it, Melanie.
So there was mention before of avoiding potential triggers and also mention of code switching involving unspoken, like hidden rules. Well, I'm autistic. I have an inability to intuit hidden rules and an inability to intuit what might trigger somebody else. And I know that a lot of other people working in peer roles are in my position. So what would you recommend to support peer specialists, or if you're a peer specialist yourself, who is autistic and has this particular struggle that I have?
Mhm. So, we actually, have a youth peer advocate, that has autism. And we support, our agency specifically that I work for, AspireHope New York. We have, a great deal of, services that we help support within the OPWDD world also. For me, one of the pieces that I've always done is, I have those people who I go to that I feel are very, very aware when I need to offer support in maybe a different way. And so I've got a couple of people within our own agency that I go to and I say, hey, how might I teach this differently to help with some of that? Because I think some of that is just in teaching and using those people's strengths, because we all have strengths that we bring to the team, right? And so I think but to your point of some of those social pieces or some of those triggers, I don't know if I have a specific answer. Meghann might. I don't, Melanie. What I can say though is that, when I look at the youth peer advocate, that she does, she rolls with it. She sometimes does say something that you're like, well, I don't know if you read the room, but that's okay. You know what? She smiles, she rolls with it. And she has this energy that just brings about it that, she wasn't trying to trigger somebody. And so she has her own strengths that she brings, just like I bring strengths and you bring strengths, Melanie, and Meghann does, and we all bring these different strengths. And I think some of it is about understanding that there is neurodiversity, and some of that is educating other staff on what neurodiversity is, as part of that supportive strategy. So I don't know if I really answered your question, Melanie, because I think I kind of took it a little bit of a different way.
Add on to it a little bit. So,
Go for it, Meghann.
sometimes not even just in a professional sense, sometimes as just individuals, we all say things that might be triggering to someone else, so someone else might be offended by. It's a human thing. It has nothing to do with any particular diagnosis. However, some of us might struggle with that more than others, and that's completely okay. And that's why being part of a peer community is supportive and acknowledging of that. Now, when it comes to triggering statements in general, we are not always going to know what will trigger the other person. And we can't hold ourselves accountable to know things that someone else might be thinking and haven't communicated. If we know someone's trigger, we can try to accommodate and be supportive and compassionate towards that. But if we don't, it's just something that we have to realize, and we also have to move forward so we can acknowledge, hey, I didn't mean to trigger you. I'm sorry if I came off a certain way. This is what I meant to say. Or, hey, I'm sorry that triggered you. I didn't mean it to hurt you that way. I apologize. And then you just keep your perspective to yourself after that. Both scenarios are okay. So I hope that answered your question. Do we have any other questions?
And Melanie, if you have any follow-up questions to that from something we said, please feel free to ask it or throw it in the chat box too, and we can always get back to you too if we don't have a space in this time. And I know there was a comment made. There's a gap missing. Definitely when we look at different systems and the training. I think one of the pieces that youth peer advocates that I support are we do have more training for individuals who are working within OPWDD systems. But there is a big gap there. And I think you are very right, Kathy, that there is a gap there. There is not necessarily a lot of education and training out there some of the time. Yes. Any other questions people have before we wrap up with a couple final points? All right, well, Meghann, it looks like you've got 2 minutes and I've got 2 minutes. If you want to share your last point, and then I can share my last point, and we'll go on.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Katie and Megan. I'm gonna do a little bit of a closing kind of summary. So if you just want to take like a minute each, and then
Yep.
I'll take the last minute.
Mhm.
I'll be
Perfect. Thank
quick
you.
if you want to go on to the next slide.
Yep.
All right, and then opportunities for growth. So one of the things that we do opportunities for growth is boundaries. We want to understand and clarify role dynamics. We want the YPAs to understand HIPAA and to be able to explain HIPAA to the youth they're working with. We want to be awareness of altruism, where youth start to want special treatment. We want to be able to teach these YPAs how to set those proper boundaries. And then please, if you're taking notes, write this one down. Transference and countertransference. YPAs are going to be more sensitive to experiencing countertransfer because their relationship with the youth is not clinical and it doesn't have those clinical boundaries and barriers. So we want to be conscientious of that, because a YPA can be more like a big sister, big brother type of mentor, and that youth can develop that attachment. So transference and countertransference, we need to educate our YPAs on those. We also want to talk about boundaries, clarify those, establish those. And then we have professional development. Professional development, we want to coach, we want to teach, we want to embrace. And I'll pass it over to Katie.
All right. My final thoughts is just my big push for making sure that as we are supervising YPAs, that we don't miss the piece that was most important for bringing youth peer advocates on. I'm a big firm believer in grassroots movement, and these services were advocated for years in order to help support the youth. And so in order to help support the youth, we really need to give the youth peer advocates their tools that they need to have in order to do that, and not lose our focus about how important it is for the youth to not be alone. And I will pass it over to Matthew.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan, Katie, for this presentation. Thank you to our sponsors at OMH, our partners at the Alliance for Rights and Recovery, and thank you to all the participants here who took time out of their busy day to attend this session. Just a couple of reminders. First of all, in order to earn CE credits for your participation, you must complete the workshop evaluation that you will receive by email from the Alliance. So that's going to be an email from @rightsandrecovery.org within 48 hours. This session is worth 1.25 CEs. I just want to clarify that. I think Rita misspoke this morning and said that it would be 1.5 CEs, but it's in fact 1.25. So 1 1/4. So I threw some things into the chat. If you're going to attend the lunch session, which includes members of the Office of Advocacy and Peer Support Services, as well as some of the regional representatives from the Alliance and the Independent Practice Association of peer-run organizations across the state, you'll want to follow the first link, and that's from 12:15 to 12:45. That event is. So you have 15 minutes between now and then. Or if you're going to be just hopping into the events starting at 1 o'clock, you'll want to follow the second link at 1 o'clock. So feel free to copy and save those links as necessary. A recording of this session is expected to be available within 30 days of the end of the summit, which is March 22nd, next Friday. Again, there is a day 2 of this summit. So thank you for your participation in the summit in general, and we certainly hope to see you again as we're able to kind of replicate and continue to provide these sorts of offerings. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for being here, everyone. If you have any